Open the trunk. Officer Brett Harlan rested his hand on his belt and fixed his gaze on the single father standing beside the aging sedan, as though the verdict had already been decided and all that remained was the formality of announcing it. Ethan Rourke asked what probable cause justified the search, but the officer only smiled and said he had a way of recognizing the kind of person who tends to keep certain things hidden in the back. Ethan held his breath for exactly 1 second, then reached down without protest and released the latch. There were no narcotics, no cash, no weapons hidden beneath the spare tire or tucked into the wheel well. Only a sealed black fireproof box bearing the official stamp of the Virginia office of the Attorney General. When Harlan leaned forward and read his own name printed on the evidence label, the smile left his face as cleanly as a light switching off. A half-second later, his partner reached up and cut the feed to his body camera. If you believe the truth always leaves a trail, stay close, because that badge is about to fall harder than either of them could have predicted. Ethan Rourke had not planned to drive through the Hawthorne corridor that afternoon, but the most direct route to the state capitol ran straight through the northern edge of Bellwether, and he had already delayed the trip for longer than he could justify. He had spent 3 months sitting with a fireproof box sealed on the top shelf of his garage, telling himself he would make the delivery when the timing felt right, knowing in the quieter part of his mind that no timing was ever going to feel right for this particular errand. The box belonged to Claire, or rather, it carried the last thing she had asked him to finish. The final chapter of an investigation she had spent 2 years building before illness stripped away the time she needed to see it through. She had whispered the instructions during one of her clearer afternoons, made him repeat the address back to her twice, and told him she had already been in contact with the prosecutor's office, so he would not have to explain everything from the beginning when he arrived. Ethan had listened, nodded, and then spent 3 years convincing himself he was not yet ready, which was another way of saying he was not yet ready to close the door on her completely. The drive had been quiet, the traffic light, and the afternoon overcast in that particular gray-white way that made Virginia feel suspended between seasons, and he had loaded the box that morning with the same methodical care he brought to every piece of work in his audio restoration shop. Checking the tamper seals, confirming the chain of custody documentation was in order, logging the trip in the secure tracking system that would timestamp his departure and registered route. He had merged onto Hawthorne Street, set his hands at 10 and 2, and driven exactly at the speed limit for 11 blocks, before the lights behind him began to strobe blue and white in the rearview mirror. The patrol car had materialized as though it had been waiting in one of the side streets, and Ethan pulled to the curb with the practiced patience of a man who had done nothing wrong and knew it. Officer Brett Harlan was 36 years old, broad in the shoulders, and moved toward the driver's window with the ease of someone who has learned that most people will answer any question asked by a uniform without first asking whether they are required to. He said Ethan had changed lanes without signaling, which Ethan knew was not true. He had activated the turn indicator 3 full seconds before the lane change, an instinct from a decade of disciplined driving. But he said nothing beyond a polite acknowledgement and handed over his license and registration without being asked a second time. Harlan ran the documents through, came back with no findings of any kind, and then shifted into a second register entirely, asking where Ethan was headed, what kind of work he did, whether he was carrying any prescription medication, whether there was any cash in the vehicle, whether he had ever been arrested. Ethan answered each question in the same measured tone, noting the way Harlan's eyes moved over his responses without registering them, cataloging each answer, and then moving immediately to the next question, as though the words themselves were not the point. Kessler, who was 40 and had been Harlan's partner for 9 years, walked the perimeter of the sedan with deliberate slowness, leaning to look through the rear window, and placing one hand briefly on the passenger door handle in a gesture that was not quite pressure and not quite request. Ethan tracked the movement in his side mirror and said nothing but made a quiet mental note of the time and location, adding it to the file that was already opening in the analytical part of his mind, the way a program opens when the right conditions are met. Harlan returned to the window and announced that he detected the odor of cannabis emanating from the vehicle, a claim so untrue that for a moment Ethan simply blinked, processing the gap between the words and reality the way an engineer processes a reading that clearly cannot be correct. He had not smoked in his life, the car carried no passengers who might have, and the sealed box in the trunk was the only unusual cargo. But he understood, with a cold clarity that settled in his chest like ballast, that Harlan had not said this because he believed it, but because it was a key that fit a particular lock. "I don't consent to a search," Ethan said, and the words came out flat and clean, not confrontational, not afraid, just accurate. Harlan looked at him for a moment, with an expression that was almost amused, the way a man looks at someone who has made a move that will not change the outcome of the game, and then he walked around to the back of the car and placed one palm flat on the trunk lid. The street sounds continued around them, passing traffic, a distant signal change, the mechanical ordinary noise of a city that did not know it was about to become relevant. Ethan stood still, because stillness was the only form of control still available to him, and waited for whatever came next to make itself known. "Open it," Harlan said, "or I'll open it for you." Ethan did not comply, but he did not resist, and the difference between those two positions was the first wall he had quietly constructed before leaving the house that morning. He said, clearly for the second time, that he did not consent to the search, and that if the officers chose to proceed, they were doing so without his authorization, and he would be documenting that distinction precisely. Harlan made a sound in his throat that was somewhere between a laugh and a dismissal, then gestured to Kessler, who stepped forward, inserted the release, and the trunk rose on its hydraulics in the pale afternoon light. The interior held what any careful observer would see in 3 seconds. A canvas duffel with a change of clothes, a padded case containing Ethan's audio restoration tools, a folded emergency kit, and the black fireproof box sitting flat against the back edge, secured with a nylon strap and accompanied by a sealed legal transport envelope. Harlan reached in without hesitation and pulled the transport envelope first, holding it up as if he expected it to incriminate itself by proximity, and then his eyes moved to the label printed on the side of the box. He read it once, then again, with the careful stillness of someone trying to decide whether the words before him were a mistake or an ambush. The label read Bellwether Police Department, Asset Seizure Review, and beneath that, in clean type, 2 names in sequence, Officer Brett Harlan, Officer Wade Kessler. The change that moved across Harlan's face was not subtle, but it was brief, a flash of recognition colliding with something that was fear, and then the practiced exterior clicking back into place over both of them. Kessler had moved to the side of the car and now looked up from his phone with an expression that had shifted from routine to alert. And then, in a motion so practiced it seemed almost reflexive, he reached up and pressed the button on his body camera until the small indicator light went dark. Ethan saw it happen and stored the timestamp in his mind, because the camera log would record the manual shutdown regardless of whether the footage was preserved. Harlan asked Ethan to step back from the vehicle in a tone that had lost its casual edge, and Ethan asked whether they had a warrant to open the box. Harlan said that any item discovered in a vehicle during a lawful stop was subject to examination, and the emphasis he placed on the word lawful told Ethan precisely how little Harlan believed what he was saying. Kessler murmured something that sounded like they should call a supervisor. But Harlan shook his head with the decisiveness of a man who understood that if the box was logged through proper channels, a chain of events would begin that he would have no mechanism to interrupt. Harlan lifted the box out of the trunk with both hands, announced that it was being seized as a suspicious item pending further investigation, and looked at Ethan with the confidence of someone who has taken things before and never faced consequences for the taking. Ethan looked back at him and said, very quietly, "The moment you picked that up, a copy of everything inside it was already gone." Harlan's expression said he believed this was a bluff, which was exactly the calculation Ethan had expected him to make. Ethan explained, without drama or hurry, that the box contained an accelerometer and a GPS monitoring chip tethered to a registered transport route, that any deviation from that route or any unauthorized movement triggered an automated protocol that pushed an encrypted copy of all stored data to a secure off-site server along with precise coordinates, timestamp, and identification of every registered device within 30 feet of the activation point. He said it the way a technician describes a system he designed himself, with the mild patience of someone explaining a physical law. Kessler pulled out his phone with the speed of someone who suddenly needs to verify something private, and 2 seconds later he pressed the body camera indicator light again, and the small green LED reappeared. A notification had come through the dispatch system asking why his device had dropped off the network, which was the kind of question that generated a record, regardless of how it was answered. Harlan reached for Ethan's wrists anyway, announcing obstruction, because the one skill Brett Harlan had refined over 11 years in uniform was the ability to manufacture escalation and make it look like response. Ethan did not move away, did not raise his hands, did not tense. He simply asked in a clear voice what specific conduct constituted the obstruction and requested that Harlan state the charge on the record, a question precise enough that Harlan could not answer it without either inventing something audible or staying silent. A man walking on the opposite sidewalk had stopped and raised his phone, and Harlan told him to keep moving in a voice that was 3 degrees sharper than the situation called for. Kessler pulled Harlan a step away and said something very low, and Ethan caught enough of it to understand that Kessler was suggesting they release him and file nothing, that the cleanest outcome was a stop that officially had not yielded anything of note. Harlan refused, because Harlan had already decided that the box needed to disappear, and that the window for making it disappear was narrowing with every passing minute of daylight and every person who slowed their car to look at the scene. He called the station and reported he had located suspicious documentation in a private vehicle, and Ethan's phone buzzed on the center console, and the screen lit up with a name he recognized. Special Prosecutor Evelyn Harrington. Harlan reached through the open window and picked up the phone before Ethan could take a single step toward it. Harlan ended the call before it connected, set the phone face down on the roof of the car, and informed Ethan that he was detaining it as potential evidence of electronic fraud, a charge that did not exist in any statute Ethan knew of, and which told him a great deal about how far Harlan was willing to improvise. Ethan said that the phone was personal property with no connection to the traffic stop, and that confiscating it without warrant or specific probable cause constituted an illegal seizure, and he said this not because he expected Harlan to agree, but because he needed the refusal to be stated aloud in a setting that was still recording, still time-stamped, still real. Harlan did not respond directly. He simply picked up the phone and dropped it into his shirt pocket in a gesture so casual it seemed designed to communicate that rules were a courtesy he extended to some people and not others. Kessler said, in a low voice aimed at his partner, that every additional action they took in the next 5 minutes was going to require a signature on a form, and that forms had a way of surviving things that verbal agreements did not. Harlan told him to write whatever he wrote, and that it would be fine, which was the answer of a man who had been told it would be fine a sufficient number of times that he had stopped examining the premise. Ethan watched the exchange between them and felt something adjacent to recognition, because Claire had described this exact dynamic in the notes she had left him, the way the more cautious partner always accommodated the more aggressive one, until the moment arrived when accommodation was no longer survivable. He thought about her then the way he always thought about her in moments that required him to be very still, not with grief exactly, but with the sharp, specific ache of a conversation he had never fully finished. In the final months, she had been convinced her phone was being accessed remotely, that sources had gone silent in coordinated ways, and Ethan had told her she was working too hard, that the stress of the diagnosis was distorting her perceptions. He had said these things gently and with absolute confidence, because he was an engineer and she was sick, and he had believed those two facts together explained everything, and he had been wrong about that, catastrophically wrong. After she died, when he finally unsealed the storage drives she had left with instructions encrypted beneath layers of software he had to reverse engineer over the course of a winter, he found 47 files organized by date, by officer name, by route, and by the amount of property removed without receipt, and the last audio file she had recorded was addressed to him by name and opened with a sentence he had replayed too many times to count. "If you are hearing this, I need you to stop feeling guilty and start driving." In the present, Harlan put Ethan in the back of the patrol vehicle, placed the box in the cruiser's trunk without a seizure log, and pulled into traffic without anything that resembled proper procedure. A quarter-mile behind them, the black box's locator chip registered the deviation from its registered route and sent a signal that Harlan had no way of knowing was already in transit. The Northern Precinct building was a low brick structure that had been expanded twice in 30 years and showed it in the way its additions never quite matched the original facing, and Ethan sat in the back of the patrol car and studied the seams in the masonry while Harlan went inside to speak with whoever was going to handle what he had brought in. Kessler remained with the vehicle and said nothing for 9 minutes, which was the longest silence Ethan had experienced in a confined space with another person, and he respected it in the way he respected all silences that contained information. When Harlan returned, he was accompanied by Captain Preston Wycliffe, who moved through doorways like someone accustomed to rooms organizing themselves around his presence, and who shook Ethan's hand in the lobby with a warmth that would have seemed genuine to anyone who did not notice how quickly his eyes moved to the box before he finished the handshake. Wycliffe said he understood Ethan had encountered something of a misunderstanding on Hawthorne, and that misunderstandings could almost always be resolved with a plain conversation and a little goodwill on both sides. Ethan asked to speak with his attorney, and Wycliffe said that the situation was not at a point that required legal counsel. Ethan said that regardless of what point the situation was or was not at, he was exercising his right to counsel and would not answer substantive questions until that counsel was present. Wycliffe kept the warmth in his voice but let it thin at the edges, and Ethan walked through the list of concerns he had already raised on the road: the stop without articulable suspicion, the fabricated cannabis odor, the search without consent, the disabled camera, the seized phone, the unlogged confiscation of a sealed transport item, framing each item not as an accusation but as a factual sequence, because a sequence is harder to argue with than an accusation. Wycliffe's expression moved through several calibrations over the course of this recitation, settling finally into the kind of professional steadiness that men with long institutional memory deploy when they realize a situation has become more complicated than it was described to them. He sent Harlan and Kessler to write their accounts separately, and both officers understood that meant they needed to agree on a narrative before those accounts were compared. Harlan's version stated that Ethan had voluntarily opened the trunk and that the box had been discovered in the ordinary course of the subsequent examination, and what neither account mentioned was that Kessler had deliberately deactivated his camera at the moment the evidence label became legible, because some facts do not improve any story they are inserted into. Wycliffe read both accounts and made a decision that told Ethan everything about how the past 3 years had been allowed to continue. He ordered the box placed in the temporary evidence room rather than flagging it immediately to the supervisory chain, the decision of a man who believed he still had time to manage the situation and had not yet understood that time had already run out. Ethan was brought to an interrogation room without a phone call, without counsel, and without any documentation of the reason he was being held. 3 floors up and across the building, the corridor camera recorded all of it anyway, and Evelyn Harrington walked through the lobby entrance carrying a sealed judicial order before Ethan had been sitting alone for 22 minutes. She presented the order at the front desk with the efficiency of someone who had prepared it weeks ago and had been waiting only for the right moment to deploy it, and the desk officer read it twice before calling Wycliffe down with a tone of voice that conveyed the information before the words did. Evelyn Harrington was 46, worked for the State Attorney General's office, and had the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have learned that urgency is a form of vulnerability. She moved quickly, but without visible hurry, which was its own kind of authority, and she had been the name Claire reached out to 19 months ago. The contact passed along with the instruction that this was a person who could be trusted to receive evidence and understand what it meant without losing it in the bureaucrat machinery that swallowed smaller submissions whole. She told the front desk that Ethan Rourke was a legally designated evidence transport agent operating under the written authorization of the Attorney General's office, and that his continued detention without counsel or documented charge was a violation she intended to address formally if it was not resolved in the next 3 minutes. Wycliffe arrived and attempted to explain, and Evelyn produced a signed letter of authorization identifying Ethan by name, vehicle registration, and the specific sealed container he was transporting, making clear that the container was the property of an active state investigation and not subject to local department custody. She requested the full footage from both body cameras and the patrol dashcam. Harlan said his device had experienced a technical failure. Kessler said his had briefly lost signal, but a technician pulled the device activity logs and found that Kessler's camera had been manually deactivated at 14:47 and reactivated at 14:53, a 6-minute window corresponding exactly to the period between the moment the evidence label became visible and the moment the dispatch inquiry arrived on his phone. The box was retrieved from the temporary evidence room still sealed, and Ethan examined the exterior casing with the attention he brought to any piece of hardware he was responsible for. The tamper indicators were intact, but along the lower edge of the locking mechanism, where the brushed steel met the casing seam, there was a fresh scratch approximately 2 centimeters long, the kind of mark left by something inserted and then withdrawn in haste, and the access logs from the evidence room entry system showed that the employee badge used to enter the room belonged to Captain Preston Wycliffe. Mara Whitlock, a civil rights attorney who had been tracking Harlan and Kessler across 7 separate cases for 14 months, arrived at the precinct exit at the same moment Ethan walked out. Not a coincidence, since Evelyn had called while the paperwork was being processed, and told him as they stood on the sidewalk with the late afternoon pressing down around them that the officers were almost certainly already working on a report that would make him the story. The state's Forensic Technology Division operated out of a building in Richmond that resembled a mid-century insurance office, and Ethan worked alongside 2 state technicians to decrypt the data, providing the key sequence Claire had embedded in a set of audio recordings left with her estate attorney under instructions to release them on the anniversary of her death, which meant he had carried the knowledge of this moment for 11 months before he walked out of his garage with the box. The decryption process took 4 hours and produced a directory structure so organized it was almost a portrait of his wife, everything labeled, cross-referenced, and annotated in the particular shorthand she had developed over 15 years of filing stories under deadline. The directory contained documentation of 47 traffic stops spread across 31 months, each file combining elements that repeated with the statistical regularity that makes randomness an impossible explanation. Harlan had cited the odor of a controlled substance as justification in 39 of the 47 instances, a figure that was not credible on its own and became less credible when mapped against the geographic concentration of the stops. 90% occurring on 3 specific corridors known for older vehicle registrations and addresses associated with residents well below the median household income threshold. The pattern of camera deactivations was documented from external footage, convenience store cameras, a traffic monitoring system at one intersection, and footage from a transit authority bus that happened to be stationary at the relevant location on 6 separate dates. Cash seizures across the documented incidents totaled an amount that ran well north of $240,000, only a portion of which appeared in any property room log. Anything not logged could not be audited, and anything not audited could not become a line item in a report that required a signature. There were audio recordings among the files as well, internal and unguarded. The kind made when someone leaves a device running in a place where people speak without weighing their words. In one recording, Harlan's voice came through, clearly saying they ought to keep targeting vehicles registered in the Mill Creek zip codes because those owners couldn't afford to make a legal issue of anything. And Kessler laughed in the way people laugh at things they find funny and uncomfortable in equal measure. In another clip recorded in what sounded like a precinct break room, Harlan said the captain only wanted clean numbers and didn't care how the numbers got cleaned, so everybody needed to stop worrying about the paperwork as long as the paperwork landed right. The recording did not contain Wycliffe's voice, did not prove he had received any portion of the seized funds, but was consistent with a pattern of conduct that required someone in authority to either notice and ignore it or actively facilitate it, and both possibilities led to the same corridor. Evelyn wanted to continue the investigation quietly, to build the evidentiary record fully before any public disclosure might allow peripheral actors to coordinate their accounts. Mara wanted it public immediately, because Harlan and Kessler were still on active duty and still appearing at the addresses of people whose names were in Claire's files. Ethan listened to both arguments and thought about Claire's voice in the last recording he had found on the drive, where she had said that the cruelest thing about this kind of corruption was that it was most efficient against the people who most needed the system to work correctly. That evening, Mara received a call from a man named Jonah Bell, who said that Brett Harlan had appeared at his front door 2 hours earlier and asked whether he had ever spoken with a journalist named Claire Rourke. The formal report Harlan filed the following morning described an encounter that bore enough surface resemblance to what had actually happened on Hawthorne Street that an uninformed observer might have accepted it, and enough deliberate distortion that it functioned less as a record than as a preemptive argument. The report stated that Ethan's driving had been erratic before the stop, that he had displayed elevated anxiety during the initial interaction, that he had opened the trunk voluntarily when asked, that the box inside had lacked any documentation recognizable as a lawful transport authorization, and that Ethan had made statements suggesting the material would damage law enforcement officers if it became public. A phrasing designed to make his reasonable description of the chain of custody system sound like a threat. Kessler signed the report as a confirming witness, which meant both men had attached their names to a formal record of events that the corridor camera, the dispatch log, the device activity report, and the transport authorization letter all contradicted in documented sequence. Wycliffe called a brief press statement the same afternoon describing a departmental review of a citizen complaint involving a private individual who may have been collecting law enforcement data without authorization, and the story that reached local outlets within 24 hours framed Ethan as a grieving husband who had become obsessive about his wife's unfinished work. The implication that a professional audio technician might have altered evidence to suit a personal narrative was calibrated precisely because doubt is a seed that grows in whatever soil it finds. Mara located the bystander who had filmed part of the stop on his phone, and the footage showed Ethan standing back from the vehicle with his hands at his sides, Harlan opening the trunk without any visible gesture of invitation, and Kessler moving to the rear and then, in a motion lasting less than 2 seconds, reaching up toward his chest-mounted camera. The audio was wind-distorted and captured almost nothing intelligible, which meant it documented the shape of what happened without providing the substance, useful and insufficient in equal measure. Ethan mentioned to Mara, with the mild tone he used when describing something he had built and forgotten about, that his car was fitted with an audio capture system he had installed 2 years earlier to monitor engine noise signatures, a professional habit from his restoration work, where ambient sound in a moving vehicle often contaminated recordings and needed to be accounted for. The system ran continuously whenever the engine was running, wrote files in 4-minute intervals, and synchronized automatically to the home server in his garage each time the car connected to the wireless network, and he had connected the car to the network when he returned from the impound lot, and the synchronization had completed before anyone thought to look at what it contained. When they went to retrieve the capture hardware from the vehicle, the mounting bracket was empty and the unit was gone, removed without documentation and without any entry in the property log. Harlan had operated under the assumption that removing the device was the same as removing the record, a category error that Ethan, who spent his professional life proving that data outlives its original container, had anticipated with the same calm he brought to everything else. The home server in his garage held a complete time-stamped copy of the audio file covering the full duration of the traffic stop, and he had not mentioned the backup system to anyone, not from secrecy or strategy, but simply because he had learned from years of restoring things other people thought were lost that the first question in any recovery is not what is missing, but where it was last intact. The recording was clear enough to be admissible under the technical standards Evelyn's office used, and what it contained was specific enough that when transcribed it ran to 11 pages. Ethan could be heard stating twice that he did not consent to the search. Harlan could be heard fabricating the cannabis odor claim in language that had the quality of a phrase field-tested on previous occasions, and there was a stretch of approximately 4 minutes during which the ambient sound changed in a way that indicated the recorder was in the trunk, and during that period 2 voices discussed the box in terms direct enough to leave no interpretive space. Harlan said they needed to make the box go away before it got logged anywhere official. Kessler asked whether they could say the driver had opened it voluntarily. Harlan confirmed that was exactly what the report was going to say, and Kessler said he was worried Wycliffe wouldn't cover for them this time, and Harlan responded with a certainty that indicated institutional experience. The captain had been covering for them for 3 years and had as much reason to continue as they did. Evelyn now possessed 4 independent evidentiary lines collectively documenting unlawful stops, fraudulent reporting, intentional camera deactivation, an attempted evidence seizure, a formal false report, witness intimidation, and an explicit recorded conversation confirming premeditated falsification of official records. A controlled piece of information was introduced into an internal communication chain, a note suggesting that Claire had sent a final backup to a private secure storage facility in the city, and that the facility was holding it under her name pending authorized pickup. The communication was designed to be visible only to 3 people in the department's hierarchy, and Ethan returned to his shop, waited, and monitored the access logs on the registered route system that still tracked who queried certain facility addresses within the law enforcement database. Less than an hour after the information was placed, someone ran a search on the facility's address using a department credential. The private secure storage company occupied a converted warehouse space near the River District, and the state investigation team had coordinated with the facility's management 24 hours earlier to ensure that any law enforcement approach would be handled according to a specific protocol. Staff would decline access, cite the absence of a court order, and preserve every communication and action on internal recording systems. 2 investigators in plain clothes were positioned inside the facility before business hours ended, and they waited with the particular patience of people who have learned that most traps spring themselves if you build them correctly and then leave them alone. Harlan and Kessler arrived at 6:40 in the evening, out of uniform, in a private vehicle, and presented the front desk attendant with a form purporting to be an emergency administrative access request, bearing an electronic signature that matched Preston Wycliffe's authorization credentials. The attendant reviewed the form, noted the absence of a judicial order, and declined. Harlan announced the facility was subject to operational review for interference with a law enforcement investigation, a mechanism that did not exist, but was the kind of statement that sometimes works on people who do not know that it does not. The attendant, briefed by the investigators the previous afternoon, remained courteous and immovable, and the entire exchange was recorded from 4 angles on a system that Kessler spent a noticeable portion of the conversation trying to locate. Kessler asked Harlan, in a voice low enough to indicate he did not know he was still audible, whether Wycliffe had actually authorized the document himself, or whether it was going to be a problem if anyone checked the metadata on the signature file, and Harlan said the captain didn't have to authorize it personally. He just had to not know it had been used, a formulation that clarified the nature of their working relationship with Wycliffe in terms that served the investigation considerably better than anything Evelyn had been able to demonstrate from the precinct records alone. When the investigators presented their identification and asked both men to accompany them for questioning, Kessler asked for an attorney within the first 40 seconds, which was the correct instinct applied approximately 2 hours too late, and Harlan maintained through a 90-minute initial interview that they had gone to the facility in a private capacity to retrieve an item belonging to the department. Evelyn's team played the trunk recording first, then the facility footage, then a side-by-side comparison of Harlan's official report against the 7 separate factual records that contradicted it in sequenced detail, and Harlan went quiet in the middle of his own sentence and did not complete it. Deputy Chief Julian Carrington was in the building before 9 o'clock the following morning, and the first question he asked when Evelyn laid the complete file in front of him was how long this had been ongoing, and when she told him 31 months, he sat with that number for a moment, as though testing whether it was the kind of weight a chair could hold. Then the call came through. The internal case management system had been accessed remotely the previous night, and 41 of the 47 case files referenced in Claire's data had been deleted from the department's server, and the deletion log showed Preston Wycliffe's administrator credentials. Claire had suspected, with sufficient precision to act on the suspicion, that the internal records were not safe. She had written in one of her annotated files that data managed by the people under investigation tended to have a shorter lifespan than data managed by anyone else. And she had solved the problem in the practical way she solved most problems, before it could interfere. The backup drive contained not only the evidence she had collected independently, but a mirrored copy of the relevant case files downloaded from the city's records infrastructure across a 4-month period, each file time-stamped and hash-verified against the original in a manner that made any subsequent alteration to the source records provable by direct comparison. The deleted files were still intact in the backup, and Wycliffe had removed the originals from a system he controlled without knowing that a copy predating his access existed outside the system he controlled, and the deletion itself, rather than reducing the evidence, had added a documented offense to the record Evelyn was assembling. Carrington reviewed the full set of documentation over a morning session that ran 2 hours longer than scheduled, working through the 47 stop files, the financial reconciliation records, the pattern analysis of Wycliffe's approval signatures on reports containing known anomalies, and the 3 instances in which written complaints from stop victims had been administratively closed within 48 hours with no record of investigation. Wycliffe's attorney suggested his client had acted in good faith to protect his officers from what appeared to be an organized effort to manufacture evidence. A claim that the deletion timestamp, combined with the recorded audio of Harlan describing 3 years of institutional protection, made difficult to sustain. Ethan attended the formal deposition session to authenticate the technical chain of custody for the backup drive, and he sat across from Wycliffe for an hour in a room with adequate lighting and answered every question with the same precision he brought to sound work. Nothing added, nothing softened, nothing that was not exactly what the record showed. Wycliffe asked him once, during a break, why he had gone to this length for something that was not his investigation. Ethan thought about the answer for a moment, and then said it was his wife's investigation, and that she had completed 94% of it herself, and had only needed him to drive the last 6 miles. Carrington made 4 formal determinations before the working day ended. Wycliffe was placed on administrative suspension pending a full internal affairs review. Harlan's and Kessler's credentials were revoked, and their service weapons and badges collected by the property office under a 2-officer witness protocol. A complete audit of the property and evidence rooms covering the preceding 40 months was commissioned under an external firm with no departmental relationship, and the complete file was formally transferred to Evelyn Harrington's office as the supervising authority for what was now an open state criminal investigation. Harlan requested to make a statement before his badge was taken, and Carrington allowed it. Harlan said that the box in the trunk had been planted as a trap. Evelyn said the box had not cost him anything, and that what he had done after the trunk was opened had cost him everything. Kessler received his termination letter 2 hours later, delivered without ceremony, and signed for it without speaking. The formal disciplinary hearing identified 8 categories of violation across the documented record of both officers' conduct during and after the Hawthorne stop, and the board's findings did not use language like alleged or potential, because the record had been authenticated through 4 independent channels and could not be reasonably characterized as incomplete. The findings covered a warrantless search executed on a fabricated probable cause claim, falsification of an official report, deliberate camera deactivation during an active stop, unlawful seizure of a legally designated evidence transport item, interference with a state investigation, conspiracy to misappropriate evidentiary material, unauthorized use of a law enforcement database, and intimidation of a civilian witness. Harlan's response to each finding was a variation on the same argument, that the box had been constructed as a mechanism to manufacture grounds for his termination, and that a man who arrived at the scene of a routine traffic stop already in possession of evidence bearing the officer's name could not be evaluated as an ordinary civilian making an ordinary claim. The board listened to this argument and then asked him to address each finding on its own merits, which he was unable to do in terms that the recording of the stop, the device logs, the facility footage, and the deletion record would not immediately contradict. Kessler had offered full cooperation in exchange for a reduction in the disciplinary outcome, and Carrington declined on the basis that cooperation offered only after accountability became unavoidable was a category distinct from the kind that might have changed anything. Kessler had possessed the information, the access, and the institutional standing to intervene in the pattern of conduct at any of 36 moments across 31 months, and on each occasion he had made the choice that preserved his own position. The badges were collected in a conference room on the 4th floor, without audience, without ceremony, and without the kind of public accounting that Ethan had specifically requested not happen, because the moment had not been engineered for the satisfaction of watching it, and it did not need that weight added to it. Carrington handed Ethan his keys across the lobby desk afterward and asked what he believed the department owed him. Ethan said he did not want anything directed at him personally, and that the department should focus its energy on returning what had been taken from the people who had gone through the same kind of stop without a sealed box in their trunk to make the truth of the encounter undeniable. The audit Carrington commissioned extended beyond the initial 40-month scope when the external firm identified documentation gaps in an additional 11 months of records, and the final reconciliation identified 31 instances of property seizure with no corresponding court order, no property receipt issued to the vehicle owner, and no complete inventory in the departmental log. The city's legal office worked with Mara's firm to establish a restitution fund that began processing claims within 6 weeks of the audit's conclusion, and Jonah Bell was among the first group whose claims were verified. He sat across from a city representative and received a formal acknowledgement that what had been taken from him 4 years earlier had been taken without legal basis, which he told Mara was more important to him than the money, because the money was a number, and the acknowledgement was a fact about what had happened to him. 14 other claimants received similar acknowledgments in the same week, and the process continued through the following months, each resolution adding to a record that would exist independently of whether Harlan or Kessler were eventually convicted of anything. Wycliffe resigned before his disciplinary hearing concluded, and the resignation was accepted with a statement noting that the investigation remained open and that resignation did not end his legal exposure for the deletion of official records and obstruction of a state investigation. Evelyn's office declined to characterize the outcome of any criminal proceedings before they had proceeded, because outcomes belonged to courts and not to prosecutors, and the principle that the process should run fully in either direction was exactly the principle that had been violated in the case she was prosecuting. Ethan declined every media request that reached him through Mara's office, and he transferred all publishing rights to Claire's documentation to an independent investigative organization, with a condition that the identities of stop victims could not be disclosed without their explicit consent. Mara asked whether he wanted a formal role in the digital evidence verification project she was developing for community members who encountered similar situations, and he said he would offer consultation on a part-time basis but intended to keep his shop running, because the work that paid his rent and had sustained his daughter through 4 years of college was the work he understood best and did not intend to give up. His daughter called the evening after the restitution fund was announced and asked whether her mother's work had finally reached the people it was meant to reach, and he told her the most accurate answer was that it could no longer be ignored by the people who needed to confront it. 6 months later, on a Thursday in early autumn, Ethan drove the Hawthorne corridor again, not deliberately, not ceremonially, but because it was the direct route and the reason to avoid it no longer existed in the same form. The street looked the same as it always had. The storefronts set back behind narrow sidewalks, the traffic signals cycling through their sequences, the particular gray of pavement in a city that gets cold early and stays that way. The Northern Precinct building was still in the same place, though it had a new captain and a civilian oversight board that met monthly and published its meeting notes publicly. Cameras could no longer be manually deactivated during active stops. Every search required a documented basis entered into the system before any physical examination began. Seized property was assigned an electronic receipt number sent to the vehicle owner within 30 minutes, and complaints were routed to the civilian board rather than to the department's own administrative unit. These were not large victories in the accounting of people who measure systemic change, but they were specific and binding and had not existed before a man named Ethan Rourke drove this road carrying something his late wife had built, and that was a different kind of permanence than the kind that gets announced. He pulled over at a small park 2 blocks past the point where the patrol lights had first appeared behind him in February because Claire had mentioned this park in 2 separate recordings as the place where she had first spoken with one of her primary sources, a detail he had not acted on until now, for reasons he had finished trying to justify to himself. He sat on the bench for a while and then went back to the car and opened the trunk. The fireproof box was long gone, received and logged and entered into evidence, and eventually transferred to the state record system, where it would remain for as long as the case required, and in its place the trunk held a canvas bag, a folding chair, and a photograph of Claire that he had been carrying there for 2 weeks because he had not yet decided where to keep it. He stood there for a moment with the trunk open and thought about the last time he had stood in exactly this position, the way Harlan had leaned over the lip of the trunk, read the label, and felt the particular vertigo of a man who has been certain of his own immunity and suddenly is not. The badge was gone now, surrendered without noise in a room with fluorescent lighting and institutional carpet, and the system that had allowed it to function for 31 months was being rebuilt piece by piece into something that might hold the next test better than it had held the last one. Ethan placed the photograph of Claire into his shirt pocket, closed the trunk, and got back in the car. On the drive home, a patrol vehicle pulled behind him for a half-mile and then changed lanes, and in that half-mile his hands tightened slightly on the wheel, and then the cruiser turned off and the road ahead was just a road again. He noticed that he had not stopped breathing and decided that was enough for now. That evening, an email arrived from Mara with a subject line that read, "First restitution checks delivered." He read it twice, set the phone on the kitchen table, and looked through the window at the street outside. Ordinary, unremarkable, moving in all its usual rhythms, as though it had always been the kind of place where the truth eventually finds its way out of whatever box it has been locked in.
Oh shit. Oh, I should have looked into that more. He's working. What's up, Ben? Erlang, that's one of the bosses. Yeah, probably. I fought all the bosses. I just didn't beat the last one. How's your day going, Ben? Oh shit, this guy's sneaking up on me. Nice. Oh, I just got off not too long ago. Nice, nice. Good, thank you. Hell yeah, bro, of course. You know, I want to still hear people. Oh my gosh, my fuck controller. Waiting for Yab. In a give me a little bit, my brother. I'll be down though.